The day they retired the dogs, nobody paid attention to the woman standing near the fence. She wasn't in uniform. She wasn't carrying credentials, or a program, or even a camera. She stood at the edge of the crowd in a faded green jacket that had seen too many winters, her dark hair pulled back low, a paper cup of coffee going cold in her hand. People stepped around her the way they step around a parking meter, automatically, without looking. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of morning where the sky can't decide between grey and blue and settles on both. Fort Crestview's outdoor ceremony ground had been set up with folding chairs, a podium draped in the department's colors, and 7 German shepherds sitting in a perfect line like they were posing for a painting. Their coats caught the thin sunlight. Their handlers stood behind them, rigid and proud, the way handlers always stand at these things. The crowd was decent, maybe 200 people, mostly families of the handlers, some local press, a few city officials who had learned to smile at cameras without hearing what anyone was saying. Someone had put out a table with coffee and shortbread cookies near the entrance, which ensured about 30 people stayed close to the back the whole time, and near the fence, a little apart from the rest, stood the woman in the green jacket. Her name was Miriam Sable. She was 28 years old. She had driven 4.5 hours from a town called Millhaven in a truck that needed new brake pads and a prayer to stand behind a chain-link fence at a ceremony she hadn't been invited to. Nobody had told her about it. She'd found the date on a department website, buried 3 pages deep under a tab called Community Events, sandwiched between a blood drive and a fire safety open house. She had printed the page at the library. She still had it folded in her jacket pocket, creased soft from being handled too many times. She wasn't there for the speeches. She wasn't there for the photographs or the certificates or the handshakes between men in pressed uniforms. She was there for 7 dogs that she had not seen in 2 years and 3 months. The dogs had belonged to her mother. That needs explaining properly, because belonged is the wrong word. It's the word people use when they don't understand what that relationship actually is. Miriam Sable hadn't owned those dogs the way you own furniture. She had built them. 14 years on a 60-acre property in eastern Oregon, starting with 3 shepherd pups she'd bought with money she'd borrowed from her sister and never fully paid back. She learned everything the hard way, from books, from old-timers at field trials, from trial and error, and a lot of mornings that started at 4:30 and ended when she couldn't lift her arms anymore. By the time Nora was 20, her mother had developed a reputation in specific circles, not the kind of reputation that gets you on the news, but the kind that gets you calls from people who need something specific done right. Schutzhund trainers from 3 states over came to watch her work a dog through an obstacle sequence and left taking notes. A breeder in Montana once offered her $40,000 for the breeding rights to a male she'd trained named Achilles. She turned it down because she said Achilles wasn't finished yet. Miriam Sable was not a warm woman in the conventional sense. She didn't give speeches or smile for cameras. She said what she meant and then went quiet. But something happened when she was with the dogs, something that Nora had spent years trying to articulate and never quite managed. Her mother became a different kind of present. Not softer exactly, but more available. Like the dogs had access to a frequency in her that other people couldn't tune to. Nora had grown up watching that. She'd helped with feeding and socialization and basic obedience work from the time she was old enough to be trusted around the kennels, and then she had left for college at 19, which her mother accepted the same way she accepted all things, with a single nod and the instruction to call if she needed money. She had called twice in 4 years. Neither time was about money. When she graduated with a degree in animal behavior science, she came home to find the property thriving in ways she hadn't expected. Her mother had taken on a contract with a search and rescue organization in the Pacific Northwest and had been working with 4 of her best dogs on disaster response training. The other 3 she was developing for police K9 placement. The kennel was fuller than Nora had ever seen it. She moved back, got a job at a vet clinic in town, helped her mother in the evenings and on weekends. The way you fall back into a rhythm with someone you understand without needing to explain yourself to. That was the year before it happened. The theft was organized. That was the thing that haunted both of them. Long after the investigation went cold, it wasn't random. It wasn't kids on a dare or some impulsive act. Someone had watched the property. Someone had known the layout of the kennels, the positioning of the security cameras, the 3-hour window on Sunday mornings when Miriam drove into town for groceries, and Nora slept in after her Saturday night shift at the clinic. They took all 7 dogs, left the kennels unlocked, the latches bent back clean, like someone who knew exactly how they worked. One camera had been spray-painted over, the other had been angled up toward the sky, which required someone to have been close enough to touch it without triggering it. Miriam filed the police report at 7:15 that Sunday morning. She had come home from town to find the kennels empty and stood in the middle of them for what Nora later estimated was about 10 minutes before calling anyone. When Nora pulled into the driveway 20 minutes after that, her mother was sitting on the fence rail outside the kennels with her hands in her lap, looking at nothing. Nora had never seen her mother sit like that. It frightened her more than the empty kennels did. The investigation moved the way rural investigations often do, in fits and starts, with too many people involved initially, and then over weeks, fewer and fewer, until it was just a case number in a database and a detective in Portland who returned their calls about 60% of the time. Tips came in and went nowhere. A lead in Nevada evaporated. A contact in the import-export community flagged something suspicious about a shipment of working dogs headed to a broker in Hungary, but the paperwork was clean. 18 months after the theft, Miriam Sable had a stroke. She survived. Partially. She could walk with a cane and speak in full sentences on good days and fragments on bad ones. And she lived now in a facility 40 minutes from where the property used to be. They'd sold it 8 months after she got out of the hospital, because Nora couldn't afford to keep it and couldn't afford not to sell it. The money covered the care facility for a while. Then Nora's job did. Then a combination of both with margins thin enough to make her chest tight when she added it up. The dogs were never found. The case stayed open in the technical sense, the sense where it exists on a server somewhere and nobody is looking at it. Until a Tuesday in October, when Nora drove 4.5 hours in a truck that needed new brake pads and stood near a fence at a retirement ceremony at Fort Crestview and saw 7 German shepherds sitting in a perfect line in the October light. She had recognized them from a photograph. 6 weeks earlier, a woman at the care facility, an aide named Donna, who had taken a personal interest in Miriam's situation, had been scrolling through a local news site on her phone during a break and stopped at a small feature article. It was a human interest piece about Fort Crestview's K9 unit, built round the upcoming retirement of its first class of dogs. There was a photograph. 7 shepherds line abreast, in front of the department's logo. Donna had almost scrolled past it, but something in the shape of one of the dogs, the way it held its head, the angle of the ears, something she couldn't have named exactly, made her stop. She had spent enough time with Miriam to know that Miriam, on her good days, talked about her dogs the way other people talk about their children. She had heard enough descriptions. She brought the phone to Miriam during lunch. Miriam looked at it for a long time, and then she said, clearly, without fragments, "That's Kira. That's Boone." Donna called Nora that afternoon. Nora drove to the facility the same evening and sat with her mother for 3 hours, looking at the photograph on a laptop screen, zooming in on each dog. Her mother could not identify all 7 with certainty. The photograph was taken from a distance, and 2 of the dogs were partially behind others, but she was certain about 3 of them. Her posture, her certainty, the way her hand shook slightly when she pointed. Nora believed her. Nora went home that night and started making calls. She called the department's public affairs office. She was transferred twice and left 2 voicemails. She called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation to a dispatcher who was sympathetic and gave her another number. She called that number and reached a sergeant who told her he would look into it and gave her a case number, a different case number than the one she already had. She called an attorney in Millhaven who specialized in property disputes and was told that proving ownership of animals that had been in another organization's custody for over 2 years with no original registration tied to the receiving department would be, and this was the word he used, complicated. She emailed the Fort Crestview Communications Office with her mother's original kennel records, the microchip documentation from before the theft, and 3 years of veterinary records. She received an auto-reply confirming receipt. She did not hear back, so she found the ceremony date on the department website, printed it at the library, drove 4.5 hours on a Monday night, slept in her truck in a rest stop outside Crestview, and arrived at the gate an hour before it opened. The ceremony started at 10. Nora stood near the fence and watched the handlers bring the dogs out in a formal procession, each pair moving in that particular synchronized way that good handler teams move, the dog tracking its handler's left side without looking, the handler looking forward without looking down. It's the kind of coordination that takes years to build, and even from 40 feet away, it was obvious that these were excellent dogs with excellent handlers. She could see that clearly. She could also see, and this was the thing that turned her coffee cold in her hand, that one of the dogs moved in a way she knew, third from the left. A female, darker coat, broader chest than the others. She carried herself with a specific quality of alertness, a kind of horizontal readiness, like she was watching 3 things at once without her head moving. Miriam had called it open attention and said it was the rarest quality to train in and the most valuable to have. You couldn't teach a dog to have it, you could only develop what was already there. Nora had watched her mother develop it in this dog over 2 years. Her name was Briar. She had been born on the property in Millhaven on a February morning when the temperature dropped below 0 and the heat lamp in the whelping box went out at 2 a.m., and Miriam had sat on the kennel floor for 6 hours in a down coat and 2 pairs of socks to make sure all 5 pups in the litter made it through. Briar was the smallest of them. She was also the one who, at 3 weeks old, had crawled out of the whelping box when the others stayed in and sat in the middle of the kennel floor and looked around like she was taking inventory. Miriam had laughed, actually laughed, which Nora could count on one hand, and said, "That one's going to be trouble." She had been the most decorated working dog in the unit. Her handler, a young officer named Sergeant Dace Crowley, had spoken about her at the handler's banquet the previous spring. There was a write-up in the department newsletter. The photograph that Donna had found was taken partly because of her. Nora watched Briar sit in the lineup and felt something in her chest do something complicated. She hadn't planned to do anything at the ceremony. She wasn't naive. She understood the situation. She had no legal mechanism to interrupt a retirement ceremony. She didn't have a lawyer. She had microchip records and vet files and her mother's word, and none of that was going to make a sergeant in a pressed uniform stop. The proceedings on the word of a 28-year-old woman standing outside the fence in a jacket that had seen too many winters. She was there because her mother couldn't be. That was the whole of it. Someone who had loved these dogs needed to be present when they were honored, and the person who had the right to be there was sitting in a care facility 40 minutes away, unable to make the drive. The speeches started. A commander spoke at the podium about service and dedication. The mayor said something about community partnership. Someone read statistics about the number of searches completed, the narcotics located, the building sweeps conducted. The numbers were real numbers, and they represented real work. And Nora stood at the fence and listened and felt the specific loneliness of knowing something that nobody in that crowd knew. She was standing about 15 feet from the gap in the fence line, the place where the service road met the ceremony ground, where a temporary barrier had been set up that was more suggestion than structure. She had positioned herself there without quite thinking about why. Some part of her had understood something that her conscious mind hadn't articulated yet. It was during the reading of the individual commendations, each handler stepping forward to receive a certificate, each dog sitting in formal position at their side, that it happened. The commander called Sergeant Crowley's name. He stepped forward with Briar on his left, and the crowd gave him a good round of applause, the kind that means something rather than the polite kind that means nothing. Briar sat perfectly, and then the wind shifted. It was a simple thing, a change in the direction of the light October breeze, nothing more. It came from behind the fence line, behind where Nora was standing, and it moved across the ceremony ground with the particular quality that cold air has in the fall, carrying things with it. Briar's head turned. It was a small movement, degrees rather than full rotation. But her posture changed. Not a break in discipline, something different, something alert in a different way. She turned her head toward the fence line, and her ears came forward and she made no sound. Sergeant Crowley didn't notice. The commander was still speaking. Then Briar stood. She stood from her formal sit without command, which was something, Nora would later be told, that this dog had never done in 3 years of service. Not in training, not in the field, not in any public setting. Crowley looked down, confused. He tightened the lead. Briar took one step forward, then another. Then she hit the end of the lead and made a sound that stopped the ceremony. Not a bark, not a growl. A sound somewhere between a whine and something with more register to it, something that didn't have a clean word attached to it, high and specific, the kind of sound that comes from the chest rather than the throat. The commander stopped speaking, and then, in a sequence that happened in about 4 seconds, but would be described differently by every person who witnessed it, 5 other dogs stood up. They didn't bark, they didn't lunge, they stood and oriented, all of them in the same direction, toward the fence line, toward the gap in the barrier, toward the woman in the green jacket standing with a cold cup of coffee going cold in her hand. The 7th dog, a large male with a grey muzzle who had been placed at the end of the line, stood last. He had the deliberate quality of an old dog who has learned to be certain before committing. He stood and looked at the fence line for a full second. Then he made the same sound Briar had made. The handlers were pulling leads. Someone on the stage was saying something into a microphone that wasn't working properly. An officer near the barrier moved toward Nora with the specific expression of someone who has decided something is wrong before they know what it is. "Ma'am, you need to step back." Nora didn't step back. The officer, a deputy named Cal Westergaard, later described it to his partner as the strangest thing he had seen in 11 years on the job. Not the dogs exactly. Working dogs notice things. But the way they noticed, and the way they stopped, when the woman stepped through the gap in the barrier, and what happened next, that was the part he couldn't find the right words for. She stepped through and crouched down. She didn't call the dogs. She didn't reach out. She crouched low the way people crouch when they are very sure of something and want to let the other thing come to terms with it on its own time. And Briar walked to the full extension of the lead, and Sergeant Crowley, young, confused, well-trained, doing everything correctly, loosened the lead without meaning to, the way your hand does something your brain hasn't authorized yet. Briar crossed the distance in a walk that became something else in the last few steps. She reached Nora and pushed her face into Nora's neck with a force that knocked Nora back half a step. And Nora put both arms around her and said something quiet that nobody standing close enough to hear afterward could quite agree on. The other dogs were still pulling. Deputy Westergaard had stopped moving toward Nora. He looked at the stage. "Commander Aldis." No, wrong. The commander's name was different here. It was Commander Pilar Resende, was watching from the podium with an expression that had gone beyond ceremony into something more basic. One by one, with the peculiar herd logic of dogs that have trained together and lived together, and share some frequency of understanding that is not fully translatable, the other 6 were walked to the gap in the barrier by handlers who were following something they couldn't have explained in an after-action report. Nora was on her knees in the gravel. 7 dogs surrounded her, not chaotically, the way they'd been trained, attentive, close, present in the specific way good working dogs are present, which is differently from how other animals are present. The large male with the grey muzzle put his head across her shoulder from behind and stayed there. The crowd had gone quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when they understand that what they are watching is real. It took 40 minutes before anyone in the administration asked the right questions. Before that, there was a period that the department's communications director would later describe in a carefully worded statement as an unexpected pause in the ceremony proceedings. What it actually looked like was a cluster of handlers and officers standing in a rough semicircle around Nora and 7 dogs, not sure whether to intervene, not sure in what direction they would have intervened if they tried. Commander Resende came down from the stage. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s, with the economy of motion that comes from decades of doing things efficiently. She had commanded the unit for 6 years and had built its K9 division from 4 dogs to 12. She looked at the woman on the ground and the dogs around her and asked, calmly, without accusation, "Who are you?" Nora looked up. There was gravel on her knees and a German shepherd still leaning against her from the left. She said, "My mother trained these dogs." The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than what had come before. Commander Resende looked at the dogs. She had been doing this long enough to read them. What she saw was not aggression or anxiety or displacement behavior. What she saw was recognition, the specific, unmistakable posture of animals who have returned to something they understood before they understood much else. She said, "I'm going to need you to walk with me." Nora stood. Briar stayed at her left side. Nobody had told her to. What followed was not quick or easy or dramatic in the television sense. There was an interview room. There were records Nora had brought in a manila envelope in her truck, the microchip documentation, the original registration papers, the vet records with dates and weights and vaccination histories going back to each dog's first weeks of life. There was a 3-hour process involving the department's legal advisor, a call to the sheriff's department in Millhaven, and a second call to a specialist at the state veterinary database, who confirmed that the microchip numbers in the records matched the numbers on file with the state, numbers that had been registered to a kennel in Millhaven under the name M. Sable 7 years earlier. There was a moment when Commander Resende looked at the records and looked at the deputy who had pulled the acquisition paperwork for the unit and asked a question in a tone that made the deputy sit up differently in his chair. The question was, "Where did we get these dogs?" The answer, traced back through 2 intermediary transactions, a broker in Colorado and a shipping manifest with a country of origin listed as the Netherlands, was not a comfortable one. The department had purchased the dogs in good faith. The chain of custody had been falsified across at least 3 transactions. It was not a simple problem. There were legal questions that would take months to fully answer. But in the interview room that afternoon, with a manila envelope of records on the table between them, Commander Resende made a decision. She said, "Is your mother well enough to receive visitors?" Nora looked at her for a moment. "On good days," she said. The facility where Miriam Sable lived was called Cedarwood. It was not a bad place. It had good staff and large windows, and a garden in the back that residents could sit in when the weather permitted. Miriam had a room on the 2nd floor with a view of the garden and a collection of photographs on the windowsill, including one of the kennels in Millhaven taken the summer before the theft. with several dogs visible in the run. Commander Resende visited on a Friday 3 weeks after the ceremony. She came without announcement, without press, without the apparatus of official business. She drove herself in her own car and brought a folder of photographs that the department's photographer had taken of each dog over their 3 years of service. Certifications, deployments, commendations, field shots. She sat in a chair beside Miriam's bed and put the photographs in Miriam's hands. Miriam was having a good day. She looked at each photograph carefully, with the same quality of attention she had once given to evaluating a dog's movement patterns or a training sequence's breakdown. She named the ones she was certain of. She asked questions about the ones she wasn't. Specific questions, the kind that a person asks when they know enough to know what they're asking about. Commander Resende answered all of them. Before she left, she said, "The dogs served well. What was built in them held." Miriam nodded. And then she said something that Commander Resende remembered exactly, because it was exact. That's what good training is. You build something that doesn't disappear when you're not looking. The legal resolution took 8 months. There was no clean outcome. There rarely is, with cases that have moved through that many hands over that much time. 3 men were eventually identified in connection with the original theft, 2 who had been paid for access and transportation, and 1 who had organized it, a former farmhand named Gil Tremont, who had worked briefly for a kennel broker and understood the market for trained working dogs well enough to know what Miriam's animals were worth. Tremont had been in federal custody since the previous year on unrelated charges. Adding the theft and fraudulent transfer charges to his case was, the prosecutor told Nora, straightforward. It was not satisfying in the way that straightforward implies. Nothing about the past 2 years had been. What happened to the dogs was more complicated, because the law around animals and ownership and good faith acquisition is genuinely complicated, and the department had done nothing wrong in the technical sense. What Commander Resende did in the end was not mandated by a court. She was not required to do it. She arranged for Nora to have access to the dogs during their retirement placement process. She ensured that Briar, who had been designated for adoption by Sergeant Crowley, was, after a conversation with Crowley that Nora was not present for, offered to Nora instead. Crowley, who was 26 and had a new baby and a lease that didn't allow large breeds, accepted the alternative adoption placement the department arranged for him without complaint. Whether he understood fully what had happened or simply recognized something in the situation that warranted stepping aside, he had never said publicly. The other 6 dogs went to placement with handlers or veterans or families that Commander Resende personally vetted. 2 of them went together, and Briar came home with Nora, back to Millhaven, to an apartment that wasn't 60 acres, but had a park 2 blocks away, and a bedroom that got good morning light, and a woman who came home from the vet clinic every evening and sat on the floor. On a Saturday in late June, Nora drove to Cedarwood with Briar in the back seat. The facility had a policy about animals. The policy had been modified 3 weeks earlier, after Commander Resende made a phone call to the facility director. The modification was temporary, specific, and applied to a single approved visit. They walked down the 2nd-floor hallway, Briar on a lead at Nora's left, in the particular walk that the dog had settled into. Not the formal working dog left-side position, but something looser and more habitual, a proximity that said, "This is where I am," rather than "This is my station." The door to the room was open. Miriam was in the chair by the window. It was a good day. The aide had mentioned it in the hall, quietly, with the particular significance that the staff attached to good days here. She was dressed and had her hands in her lap and was looking out at the garden. She heard the footstep change, the particular sound a hallway makes when there are 4 feet rather than 2, and turned before they were through the door. Briar stopped. She stopped with a quality of stillness that was different from the trained stillness she had held in the ceremony lineup. This was something that preceded training, before commands, before a handler's lead. She stood in the doorway and looked at the woman in the chair, and for a moment neither moved. Miriam said quietly the name she had given this dog in a kennel in Millhaven, when it was 3 weeks old and crawling out of the whelping box in the dark. Briar. The dog walked forward and put her head in Miriam's lap. Miriam put both hands on her. She didn't say anything for a while. The garden was visible through the window. Autumn coming early this year, the leaves just beginning to go. Nora stayed in the doorway. She didn't have a word for what she was looking at that felt large enough. She didn't try to find one. Some things resist the effort to name them, and pushing anyway only makes them smaller. She stood in the doorway and watched her mother's hands moving slowly through the dog's coat. The same hands that had built those dogs from the ground up, that had sat in a kennel floor at 2 a.m. when the heat lamp failed, that had made something that did not disappear when she was no longer looking. And she let it be exactly what it was.